artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello, this is episode 249, and we are going to get legal today. By which I mean, I am talking with attorney Adam Unikowsky, a partner in the Appellate and Supreme Court Practice Group at Jenner & Block in Washington, D.C. He handles cases in numerous subject matter areas, including administrative law and patent law. He has argued 12 cases in the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as numerous cases in federal courts of appeals, federal district courts, and state supreme courts. He writes a newsletter on AI in law and other legal issues. Adam graduated from Harvard Law School and clerked for Justice Antonin Scalia. We're going to talk about how AI could litigate or even judge cases, and whether it should, how it can emulate specific judges, the current uptake, reliability, and reputation of AI in the legal profession, the best ways to use AI in litigation, and what's driving its adoption. Something AI can do that humans can't. How politics comes in. The future roles of litigators and AI's effects on the apprenticeship of lawyers, AI in the appellate system, and upcoming innovation in AI and the law. So let's get right into the interview. Adam Unikowsky, it's a pleasure to welcome you to AI and You. You know, if I hadn't been a computer programmer in my initial career, I might have been a lawyer just because of the appeal of the sheer pedantry of it. Plus, the instruction manuals are also called code. So there's that, which is one way of saying that in our conversation, it may be appropriate and necessary to be pedantic, and I'm giving you 100% permission to leave no nit unpicked, and especially to correct me on the slightest error that I make or imply with any of my legal terminology or assumptions, okay?
Of course.
So you have done some very interesting writing with respect to the impact of AI upon the law, and I wonder if you could summarize your evaluation of AI with respect to its utility and reliability in legal practice and adjudication.
Sure. Well, I think that AI is useful in virtually all aspects of the legal process. So some of my writing has been about using AI for judging or arbitrating. I think most people aren't quite ready to just throw away the entire legal system and turn over the keys to AI robots who are going to decide cases. That might be going a little bit too far. However, AI certainly has utility in assisting in deciding cases and maybe for private arbitration. There's just tremendous benefits, which maybe I'll get to a little bit later. It's fast, it's neutral, it's smart, it doesn't make logical errors, it's thorough, it's unbiased, so there's many advantages. And of course, you can ask it in advance how it's going to rule, which is something you can't do with a judge. In addition, so I'm a practicing lawyer, and AI has tremendous benefits for practicing lawyers as well. Again, it's unbelievably fast. It's smart enough now to already come up with most of the arguments you'd want to come up with. Certainly, it'll improve access to justice to people who can't afford a really good lawyer. It'll make the legal system move a lot faster, which will improve that system quite a lot. And it may equalize the quality of legal representation across plaintiffs and defendants, which is healthy at the end of the day. Because ultimately, when a party wins a case because he or she has a way better lawyer, in a sense, that's almost a failure rather than a success. So the justice system, you want the right person to win, the person who deserves to win rather than the person with the hired gun. And if everyone has access to these tools, that is more likely to happen because you'll have fewer cases in which the disparity of quality of legal representation is the reason for the outcome.
And that brings me to a question that I was going to get to later, but I think it's prompted now, which is how is the legal profession going to respond to that? Because when there was one way of testing that, which was someone who wanted to use a large language model speaking in their ear, as it were, in court to help them make their case, they were come down on like the proverbial ton of bricks for suggesting such a thing, and it very much resembled antibodies in a system pushing out an invader. What do you think the reaction is going to be?
Yeah, so I think that person may have been a little bit early to the party. Apparently that was a somewhat sketchy service as well. Like the LLM wasn't very good. And he was offering that service before people started to understand what AI could do. I actually think like today, if you had some headphones and a hookup and, Cloud 3.7 Sonnet or GPT 4.5, one of these services were like listening to the questions and telling you what to answer, actually the answers would probably be pretty good. They might even be better than the answers that most lawyers would give. You can't do that in court. You're not usually allowed electronics in the courtroom, maybe because the judges like the human element or maybe out of habit. But I think in today's technology, AI could suggest answers that are perfectly serviceable. In fact, there's certain weaknesses AI doesn't have, even for the oral argument process, right? It doesn't get nervous. It speaks in full sentences, doesn't trip up. It can also act more quickly than we can. And so I think that actually, I hope that a court will experiment with legalizing that.
And the courtroom is like the tip of the legal iceberg in terms of making a case. So there's that 9/10 of the work or more that it can work on, that it can help with, that isn't subject to that restriction.
That's right.
I want to ask, what was your reaction on first discovering its performance? When you saw what AI could do, how did you feel?
I was sort of shocked. I mean, we all had that moment when we started using, I guess, ChatGPT 3.5, or it was the first one that came out. So I've been reading about AI with sort of abstract interest for a few years. I'd taken some AI classes in college like 20 years ago. And like I knew at some intellectual level that in principle, there was no reason why you couldn't build a model that kind of simulated what neurons do. But it just seemed so science fiction-like that I just didn't really think this could happen. And I remember using it for the first time. I'm like, oh my God, it happened. And I just felt like the world had completely changed that day when I first started using it. It was almost like the beginning of my life, and it was like the first day of the rest of my life. Like I don't think I've ever felt that way before. Maybe when I had kids, maybe, but other than that. And, it was just so transforming, both to what I do every day, being a lawyer and writing and reading and thinking. But I was just stunned, and I felt like my entire life, my whole entire world had changed when I started to understand these large language models really worked.
And some of your first writing about this was with respect to a case where the Judge Newsom, used ChatGPT, I believe, to help make a decision about whether installing an in-ground trampoline constituted landscaping, which was something that a case hinged upon, and was transparent about what he learned in that and published it in part of his opinion. And you wrote extensively about that. What did that example demonstrate for you?
Yeah, so Judge Newsom is a brilliant judge, a really exceptional judge. And the issue in that case was, as you say, whether a trampoline was a type of landscaping, because there's an insurance policy where there's an exclusion for landscaping. And so usually when a judge tries to answer this type of question, they kind of think deeply. What is landscaping? What is landscaping? And an answer pops into their head. And he felt that maybe a large language model that had been trained on every single piece of text on the internet might be better at answering whether a trampoline is landscaping than just sort of closing your eyes and thinking about it. And so he wrote a concurring opinion saying that just asking the large language model, there's benefits to that, he thought there's harms to that. He didn't endorse it wholeheartedly, but he gave qualified support. And so I wrote a blog post saying, like, yes, I think that it deserves qualified support, but we don't need to stick to, does an ordinary English speaker think a trampoline is type of landscaping? AI is more than capable of the type of logical reasoning that lawyers and judges do. And in fact, if we just test it out, and in fact, I took that case, I put the briefs in that case into a large language model, and I said, like, figure out the right decision. And like, it did a pretty good job. Like, not only did it do that, but it wrote a judicial opinion that was quite good. And it was like, it took, of course, like 1 second. So AI is more than just is a trampoline landscaping.
And this is where the nits come in, because the first time you asked it to make that decision, it came to the same conclusion, but not for the same reasons. And that was, it decided that the definition of landscaping should not include installing an in-ground trampoline. But the case, at least at that point, hinged on the fact that the insurance contract, because this was about getting the insurer to cover the liability, that the application for insurance had included the question, do you install recreational equipment? And the plaintiff had said no. And since trampoline is clearly recreational equipment, it was held that whatever definition of landscaping you want to employ, no matter where it comes from, it can't include recreational equipment because that is in the application, and that clearly is a dominant part of the context for this decision. And it didn't say that to begin with. Then you prompted it afterwards, well, what about this? And it said, sure. Is that accurate way of characterizing that?
Yeah. So, yes. And just taking a step back, it's not perfect. It won't exactly always do what a judge would do. I mean, you can't expect that to be the case. But especially with the earlier models, a little bit of prompting and follow-up questions and back and forth kind of gets in the direction that you want it to go. Actually, the newer ones are better. Like the version I used in that blog post was like 3 versions ago. But that's another point I make. That's kind of okay in judging. In like close and difficult cases is almost definitionally the type of case where different judges would come out differently. So kind of like doesn't matter. It sounds kind of harsh, but it almost doesn't matter what the AI says because whatever it does, it's going to simulate at least what some judges would do. And it's almost more important that the system operate quickly and efficiently and neutrally, no bias, no bribes, anything like that. That's what's important. And, if it makes a mistake in a difficult case where different judges would disagree, it sort of doesn't matter institutionally. So in this case, it came to a different conclusion than human judges. But if it's a close case, it sort of doesn't make it less accurate, just makes it different. And meanwhile, if it gets the easy cases right, then you're golden.
And you did a lot of testing of how it would rule as a judge on different cases. And that was the foundation of your admiration for it. But you also said just now that you're not ready to see it take the place of a judge in making decisions, although maybe there's some nuance to that we could explore. So where do you see it being of the most benefit?
Yeah, so to answer the first part of your question, I actually think it's capable of deciding cases, at least on the papers. I mean, maybe, it may not be so good at like watching people testify and making credibility determinations based on whether they look nervous. Mm-hmm. I don't know, maybe it can do that, but it certainly many cases, if not most, are just based on the papers. And it can certainly read them, interpret them, and come to a decision quite accurately. And it was funny, I put every single Supreme Court case of last year through it and see how it did. So it was pretty accurate. It usually got what the court did. And when it diverged, it was usually thoughtful about why it diverged. And it was almost like the most interesting Supreme Court justice. If that was a justice on the court, people would be like, oh, what an interesting principled swing justice. Not always conservative, not always liberal, coming to weird conclusions sometimes, independent thinker. I think everyone would think that's the coolest, most thoughtful, most principled justice on the court. So yeah, it can judging cases is just a matter of interpreting texts, like 2 briefs that are fully within the bailiwick of AI. It can do that. I think most judges won't want to turn over the keys, as I said, but certainly most of the time and effort in the legal profession spent on lawyering, and the applications are obvious, right? I mean, you ask them to come up with a good argument, and it just comes up with a good argument.
Right. I just want to be clear here on what direction you might be advocating. And certainly the legal system in the United States is famous for being overloaded and the amount of time it takes to find a courtroom. So there would be a significant advantage to having more judges, even if some of them were AI. Do you think there's a case to be made for that? Well, you've made the case that it's competent enough to do that. Do you want to make the case that it should do that?
Well, okay. So first of all, I would favor enforcing private arbitration agreements that agree to use AI. I don't know if people are already doing that, but it seems to me that especially 2 sophisticated companies or parties come together and say, look, if we have a dispute, we're just going to write up our briefs in 10 pages and stick into an AI system, and it's going to decide and we'll stick with that. That's a quick and dirty way of resolving disputes. You don't have to pay a lot. You can even ask the AI in advance how it's going to rule and make decisions accordingly. It's great. I mean, if that people do that, I would strongly support making it legal and enforcing those awards. In court, most people in court don't want to be in court. And people don't like getting sued. And even if you're a plaintiff, it's because you think something that's terrible has happened to you. Court is a very unpleasant experience for everybody except the lawyers. And I think a lot of ordinary people would be freaked out by some beeping R2D2 coming and just spitting out the verdict. So I think turning over the keys, as I said several times, would not be popular. I do think judges can use it to help prepare orders, make recommendations, check for errors. Essentially all but the ultimate decision. I think that the AI can be an input because judges have assistants now, like law clerks, things like that, who do things, make drafts and make recommendations. So it's just in principle, there's no reason why you couldn't delegate that task to a computer as opposed to a non-judge human.
And you were clerk for Antonin Scalia, is that right?
I did.
Which I'll return to in a little bit, but the public conversation about lawyers and AI was tainted by more than one example of them embarrassing the profession with using it and not checking the results, and then filing briefs that contained references to non-existent precedents. That got a lot of attention. It got some harsh word from judges. I would have been inclined in that position to hold them in contempt, but they were more lenient. And that has probably tainted the prospect of using AI in the profession in some way. Has that been your experience? Have those incidents caused people to back off and say, don't do this, or be more cautious, or what?
Yeah, definitely. You're absolutely right. And there's two layers of that. One is that like people who don't use it, aren't that sophisticated, whatever, they just view it as this like creepy hallucination machine that should be avoided at all costs. And then also, I work at a big law firm. We have a lot of lawyers, and there's a concern that one person is being supervised closely, is going to cut corners, just use the AI. And then suddenly it's the entire law firm that is embarrassed in the media. And so there's a concern that there needs to be guardrails to prevent that. And, maybe the only way in a sufficiently large law firm to do that is just to ban or heavily restrict its use rather than creating the risk that a person's going to make a mistake. Different law firms have different views on that, but many law firms have that attitude that it could be extremely embarrassing for the firm. And so there needs to be a sort of prophylactic rules to prevent that from happening. My perspective is that, first of all, I think this problem is just going to go away. There's no reason in principle why you just couldn't plug an AI into a case law database and check the outputs. This is going to be a problem of the past. The technology is there. There's business problems. Like the AI companies and the big case law companies have had trouble coming to business deals, I think, in the last couple of years. But eventually there's so much money on the table that they'll do it. And also, like, if you or me or someone else is using it, just like be careful and don't be stupid. There's lots of tools that are very dangerous in the hands of the wrong person, right? You use like a drill, a big drill, you can injure yourself, but you don't ban drills. You just expect people to be careful. And if someone isn't careful, that doesn't mean that you ban it for everybody. And it's kind of the same thing.
And the cases we were talking about and your investigations were done with generic off-the-shelf large language models. And one can readily imagine that some companies would customize LLMs for the legal profession, reduce the odds of hallucination to a point where they might even indemnify the users of it and market these at rates just shy of what it would cost a firm to pay a senior lawyer anyway. Is that starting to happen?
So I'm acquainted with people who dream of that very business model. I don't think there's an off-the-shelf product yet that lives up to that promise. I mean, a lot of people claim their products do that, but I don't think there's any product that actually does that I've seen yet. But that is a killer app. And I think that there's business issues because the case law databases are very expensive and the people who control them charge a lot for access. So I think that there are some business issues to get over, but I think ultimately we'll see a product like that and then the industry will change a lot.
Well, that brings up a technical question. You referenced case law and you're used to accessing that through, I think, LexisNexis or something similar. And are you saying that case law, the access to it is proprietary, that large language models could not be expected to be trained on that?
Well, so a lot of case law is public. Like if you go to Google Scholar, you'll have a ton of cases, but there's also a lot of cases that it doesn't exist anyway on the internet except in these databases, which are, like, in principle, the documents are like in the public domain. They're not copyrighted, but just like the task of collecting them all from different diverse dockets and stuff and processing them, that's a lot of work. And so they charge you for that work, which is understandable.
Do you, in your investigations, then take some of these briefs and feed them in as part of the context for your queries to give it access to at least those particular briefs?
Yeah. So if one of the things that you can do if you're a lawyer and you're using AI is that you take a brief that may have case law in it and explains the case law and you say, like, what are my best responses to this or something? And then it'll do a serviceable job of writing a response brief. And yes, it'll read the case citations and what you've submitted to it, and it'll like pretend to actually recognize them, even though it's just a machine. And so, yeah, you can definitely, like, I work with documents as a lawyer, like I work with documents every day. There's always 37 browser tabs and 20 PDFs on my screen at any given time. And so, yeah, you can feed those into the system and have it like that and do a great job.
Incidentally, one quote I just got sitting in front of me from one of the columns you wrote said, solving a difficult legal case is nothing like, for example, solving an international math Olympiad problem. And I have to tell you, in case you don't know, that at least the last time I saw LLMs used on the IMO, they were 1 point shy of a gold medal.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they're already doing pretty well on the IMO. There's good reasons why the law is less complicated. Like the law is for everybody. It's for ordinary people on the street, and you don't want the law to be so complex that ordinary people can't understand it. Plus, judges have to hear all kinds of cases across everything, criminal, civil, family. I mean, the number of cases they might hear is infinite. And so it has to be accessible enough to a generalist that a generalist can understand virtually everything, which limits the complexity of any given legal doctrine. And therefore, it's going to be less complicated than the IMO. And it's at the intellectual level that I think an AI is well able to understand.
You expended a lot of words in your articles about how AI could fulfill this role that you outlined in this case of the trampoline of interpreting what the common usage of a word is, or a term, some phraseology, because of its intimate familiarity with virtually everything written about that and everything else. Is that one of the perhaps killer apps of it right now, that it could be used for understanding those terms that are ambiguous in contracts?
I'm not sure I'd say it's a killer app, but it's an app. I mean, it is the case that as lawyers, when you're interpreting a contract or a statute, you're trying to channel the neutral, ordinary person as what they would understand something to mean, which is very hard because we all have our own upbringings and experiences, and figuring out what an objective random person would think when he or she saw some document. It's not so easy, whereas AI, it's easier because there's not a person. It's just read everything in the world. So in some ways, it may be more accurate than a human at that task. That was Judge Newsom's point. But I think that actually goes way beyond that task. We've all used it for writing, persuasive legal writing and logical reasoning. If you just put in a statute or something, or just a description of a legal problem and say here's what happened to me. What can I do? What can I sue over? What are my options short of suing? It's quite sensible at coming up with a bunch of answers. It remarkably so, better than you'd think. And that's my experience.
What's the uptake of AI in law firms right now? And is a law firm that isn't doing it at a competitive disadvantage?
Mixed. So many lawyers are set in their ways and just aren't interested in using tech. And some of the best lawyers in the world are like that. And then some, especially among younger lawyers who use AI in their regular lives, use it. And then there's a whole spectrum. So, I wouldn't say uptake is that great, but it's slowly going up. Also, different clients have different comfort levels. Some clients are so scared of the hallucination issue that they're just say you can't use it. Absolutely not, no, never. And then other clients insist because they feel it's going to save them money. And then there's some that just sort of say it's discretionary. So there's just vast differences of views among both lawyers and clients. So we're in this strange Wild West world where some people are using it all the time for everything and some people don't understand it and think it shouldn't exist.
You talk about how AI can do something which is effectively impossible for human beings, which is set aside something, ignore this fact that you've already heard about. And that's sort of made famous in movies about court cases where the judge instructs the jury, give no weight to the testimony of the last witness that has been stricken from the record, and everyone knows that's not possible, and that was why they did it in the first place. How would you use that ability in litigation?
So, it's more for judging. Of course, as we know, LLMs sort of lie all the time. You can tell it to ignore something and you might not actually do it. But at least in principle, a computer is able to ignore things in ways that humans can't. So as you say, sometimes in that case, you have a confession where someone names a third party and the court is well, ignore that for the third party. I'm how are you going to do that? Whereas at least in principle, a LLM could be programmed to do that. Although the LLMs, you don't really know what they're doing behind the scenes. I mean, they seem to produce plausible outputs, but it's often very hard to tell. But yeah, assuming it's doing a plausibly good job of ignoring something, maybe you can see things that you can't. I mean, there's being influenced by inadmissible evidence is just a bad bias that just humans shouldn't have. It's just inevitable that it happens. And if we can just tell the computer not to be biased by that, that's great. Here's another example. In criminal cases, you're not supposed to hold against the defendant that he didn't testify, at least in the United States. You have a constitutional right not to testify, and so the jury cannot infer guilt from the person's decision not to testify. But juries always do that. They're well, if he was innocent, why didn't he just say what happened? And so it's very hard to avoid that extremely natural inference in your head. AI, just tell, evaluate all the evidence. It is not relevant that the person didn't testify. In principle, it could do that. It might come up with different answers, and maybe those answers will be better.
It might be something that is hard to test. I mean, when using AI to generate images, and it sticks something in there that you don't want. And I say, draw that again without the hamster. And it says, all right, here's the image, no hamster. And there's a hamster sitting there. And it will swear up and down that there's no hamster in the image, but it's put it there anyway. Then it's obvious that it is not understanding that instruction to don't do the thing that I'm saying. It would be harder, perhaps impossible, to tell whether it had followed an instruction to ignore some evidence.
Yeah, I mean, it's a high error bar. The only question is whether it makes more errors than humans do. I mean, that's what you're comparing against. I mean, that's how I feel. Like, if an AI writer drafts of something, I'm like, well, this isn't that great. But then I'm like, well, compared to what? I mean, AI makes mistakes all the time. I mean, we've all used LLMs and they just say something completely weird and wrong. Or like you said in the example of the hamster, like he'll just insist that there's no hamster there and it's there. And you suddenly realize you're talking to a robot. Like, no, it's there. So yeah, I mean, you have to take it with a grain of salt and just understand its limitations. I mean, there's some things that can do better than all. Like many people have tried, like write a sonnet about something or other, and it writes a great sonnet. Like I can't do that in like 2 seconds. And so there's some things that can just do wildly better than any human. And so it's a matter of like taking the good stuff and sort of recognizing the bad stuff.
Maybe we can look forward to judicial opinions being written as sonnets. Let's talk about something pretty contentious, which is the political leaning of judges. I mean, every judge has politics, and I don't know to what extent they're supposed to leave that out of the decisions, but it's pretty obvious to everyone now who has no intersection with the law profession that the Supreme Court decisions, for one, are influenced by politics. So then when you ask an LLM to render a judicial opinion, what politics comes into play?
You can only really test it empirically. You can just take a bunch of cases, 100 cases, and put it in there and say, like, you're a judge. Like, how would you decide it? And then sort of check how it does compared to the median Democratic and Republican judge. My experience is that it's pretty moderate. But you can also just like tell it, like, you're a conservative judge. Be conservative and then decide the case under that constraint. And it'll do that too. So if we're concerned about overly left-wing or right-wing AIs, just tell it not to be. And it's just about empirical testing. But if you empirically test it, take 100 cases and put certain assumptions in there, you will find it's like quite accurate.
Have you tried telling it to be a particular judge, like you're Scalia?
Yeah, if you ask, it's very bit of that. I mean, it has to be a well-known judge, but if you say you are Justice Scalia, like, how would you decide this case? It'll start with a little blurb about how Justice Scalia decided cases, and then say, applying those principles, I would decide this way. Again, not perfect, but it's not clear it's worse than a human would do in general. I mean, it's perfect is a high bar.
Let's do some blue sky here and think about a future where AI is used for adjudicating some cases. Maybe it's in the example that you gave. Both parties have agreed to that as because it's cheaper and quicker, for one thing. How might the role of the advocates, of the litigators, change in that scenario, given that their role is historically, my client is perfect, has done nothing wrong, and it is all as slanted, trying not to be rude here, but I'll just use that word, slanted as possible towards one side, and then the court's job is try and figure out what really happened. Do you see that shifting?
It's possible. Some, of course, maybe you have AI right for the AI. That's one possibility. But even if you had human advocates and an AI judge, it is possible that humans would perceive the AI as less emotional, less likely to respond to pounding on the table or, dramatic use of adverbs and stuff like that. And so it may be sort of more by the books, which, again, it's not, that may be an improvement. It seems bad that, for example, the outcome of a criminal case, right, whether someone's in jail for many years or free, turns on like the dramatic emotion of someone, hitting on the table. Like it's not clear that that's how the decision should be made. And so, if we make the system less emotional, like, I think emotion is great, but in the legal system, we make it a little bit less emotional. It's like not, I think it's an improvement.
Well, I can relate to that personally. Being on the autism spectrum, what was called Asperger's syndrome makes it hard for me to make eye contact. And so people like customs agents think I'm being shifty. Am I right in saying that at the appellate level, appeals courts do not take testimony from witnesses again? They consider only the written record of what was decided at the lower level. Is that correct?
Yes, the lawyers argue, but there's no testimony. It's just, the way it works is that the appellate level, like the lawyers write briefs, which are like documents that contain the legal arguments, and then the lawyers show up to the hearing and they argue to the judges, and the judges ask questions. But yeah, there's no testimony, no evidence other than what was presented in the lower court.
So that's leaning then far more heavily towards a text as the basis of making the decision. They're going over the record from the prior case and they're going through the arguments that are made by the lawyers, but there's no new evidence being presented. There's no witnesses whose veracity is to be assessed, anything like that. In your opinion, do you think that makes that a more ripe environment for AI to have a place?
I think that's right in the sweet spot of the capabilities of AI. Like, especially since the legal briefs are short enough or under the rules of pretty much every jurisdiction that they can easily fit in the single context window of a modern LLM. And so it's just so easy to put these texts in there and not just say who wins. What are the arguments on this side? What are they on that side? What are the weaknesses on this side? What are the weaknesses on that side? Like asking intelligent questions about the briefs. It's great. And it's so fast. You just put in the briefs, these very complicated legal briefs, and 5 seconds later, it's ready to answer at a high level of sophistication. So yes, I think for appellate briefing and judging, it has unique benefits.
One of the things that has come up in discussion with people in certain high-profile professions where critical decisions need to be made, and there's a lot of specialized learning that takes years, like medicine, is that AI, when it can perform these things, shortcuts or truncates the apprenticeship path because it's doing the work of the junior people in that profession, doing the work that was less appealing to the senior people and which they have already done. But when they use it to perform that work, maybe it's, I don't know, in this case, discovery, then there are people who are afraid that we will end up with fewer apprentices because the path to entering the profession has been occluded. What do you think?
Yeah, that is a fair concern. I work at a law firm and we sort of train lawyers here. They start out junior right after law school and they work for several years, kind of in the trenches, and they slowly learn and accrete knowledge. And then we encourage our associates to pursue careers at our firm. After 7 or 8 years, they've learned from older people and they become partners and then senior partners and so on. And that's the way it is. But there's a many-year training process, so you kind of learn the rules of the road. There is a concern, yes, that you look at what happens to the training. You can't become a good lawyer until you've been a bad lawyer. And if you're a bad lawyer, you'll be replaced by AI. I don't think there's a clear answer to that, except I'm just an optimistic person. I feel like people will figure it out. Plus, like if everyone is using AI, you'll just spend your 3 years like learning to deploy the AI rather than writing things by yourself. It's very easy, especially with sufficiently good AIs, to just like not think about things too hard and sort of assume the AI is fine. Like that is a concern. But, I'm more concerned about the loss of like artists than lawyers. Like the law is it's a little bit like plumbing, like it's something that just has to be done for society to function. But it's kind of like just one of these necessary expenses that people don't really want to spend money on, but they do it when they have to, and it just has to exist for our society to work correctly. But if, we invented the perfect toilet that never clogs, it would be bad for the plumber. Now, a lawyer is a little bit more intellectual than that, I suppose, although actually plumbing can be quite intellectual sometimes, I think. But people often don't want to pay lawyers. It's something they have to do rather than want to do. And so if we can reduce the number of lawyers, or at least some of the more boring tasks, I mean, it's maybe bad for the lawyer's livelihood, but for society as a whole, I think it's great. I love being a lawyer. I do it every day. But I certainly also see that it's not obvious that increasing or even keeping the number of lawyers the same is the sort of socially optimal number.
And there were some aspects of lawyering that you've written about not enjoying. I can't recall the very technical language, but it was an onslaught of an exchange of various kinds of obstructive pleadings of one kind or another. Can you see, or do you know of any work currently happening of using AI in agentic roles where it actually takes actions on behalf of the lawyer?
So, I've thought about that wonderful application. I don't know anyone who uses it that way. The agentic models are neat, but I actually don't know anyone who really uses them and maybe use them. I've never used the agentic model for like a real world application. But, we live in a great place where there's lots of innovation, and someone's going to be brave and do it and just basically say like, run my entire litigation and I'm just going to go off to the Bahamas. And, you can do everything.
And you're on the cutting edge of that, because I'll bet that most lawyers don't know what an agentic model is. Where do you think this will show up next in the profession in terms of innovation? What sort of changes or adoption? How do you think it's going to roll out?
I think that it's going to be a lot of eventually client-side pressure. Like they'll say like, we're not going to pay for attorney work for this. You're going to use AI for this, or some other firm is going to pop up and it's going to undercut the competition. And so I think just the ordinary market forces is going to cause certain types of legal work to shift to AI. There's also a dynamic other force that like the more people have access to AI, the more lawsuits they can file. we all in our lives have had moments where like something bad has happened to us and we're just like, oh, I have to get over it. I'm not going to start suing someone or hiring a lawyer. Whereas like now, if you can just go to your computer and say like, this bad thing, my contractor screwed me this way, it'll just like pop out a lawsuit. And there you go. So there may be more legal work just because people on both sides are using AI. But to answer your question in terms of uptake, I think that the expensive tasks for clients like discovery, like reviewing lots of documents, preparing very heavy discovery responses, like these things take many hours. It's meticulous, it's drudgery, and sometimes requires reviewing lots of documents. Often you have to check other people's work because it's so easy to make mistakes. That kind of stuff is really expensive for clients because you're paying by the hour. That is the type of work that I think is the bleeding edge. But more intellectual thinking type work, also, as I said, AI can, as you know, is very well able to come up with big ideas.
Well, and it very much parallels the issues that we see in a lot of other professions and also school work, education and homework, in that getting it to come up with a final product, the briefing or the paper or the opinion, is something that carries some risk of hallucination. But if you use it to do the 9/10 of the work, that iceberg below the waterline, leading up to that, then you've gotten that significant advantage without running that risk. And are you experiencing those kind of benefits already?
Yeah, so there's the 9/10 and also some tasks that are just not conducive to hallucination because you're not asking for like specific facts necessarily. It's come up with like 5 reasons as a matter of policy that class actions are bad. Okay, it's going to come up with 5 great answers. It won't hallucinate anything because it's asking for ideas rather than specific facts. Like that kind of thing, it'll just do marvelously every time. And so it's just a matter of knowing, like a person, just knowing what it's good at and what it's bad at. And if you get an intuitive sense of how to prompt it and what it can do well and what you have to check, what you don't have to check, then yes, the applications are tremendous.
Is there anything we haven't talked about that's on your mind about what AI has done, is doing, or could do?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think the answer is sort of everything. So I mean, that's part we got, like you can write laws, it could check laws, ambiguity. Essentially any aspect of the legal system, including lawmaking, and not just deciding or law arguing, I think is within its capabilities.
Well, removing ambiguity might put some people out of business. I mean, they make a living from there being ambiguity there.
That's what pays my mortgage.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. This has been a terrific journey. I love exploring new topics or topics that I have not gotten into in this amount of detail with someone who, in your case, has just gone into an area which I think lots of us have thought about, wondered about, but not understood to the depth that you have undertaken. And instead, we've had to deal with just sensationalist headlines. But I really thank you for showing us the reality of that in quite an unvarnished and useful way.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
That's the end of the interview. Adam's newsletter is at adamunikowsky.substack.com and is linked from the show notes and transcript. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, the latest generation of AI reasoning models sometimes cheat without being instructed to do so, and there's no simple way to fix it. Researchers at Palisade Research instructed 7 large language models to play hundreds of games of chess against Stockfish, a powerful open-source chess engine which they had no real chance of beating. The group included OpenAI's O1 Preview and DeepSeek's R1 reasoning models, both of which use chain of thought to break problems down into stages. The research suggests that the more sophisticated the AI model, the more likely it is to spontaneously try to hack the game in an attempt to beat its opponent. Get this, it might run another copy of Stockfish to steal its moves, try to replace the chess engine with a much less proficient chess program, or overwrite the chessboard to take control and delete its opponent's pieces. Older, less powerful models, such as GPT-4o, would do this kind of thing only after explicit prompting. The researchers are concerned that AI models are being deployed faster than we are learning how to make them safe. Quote, "We are heading toward a world of autonomous agents making decisions that have consequences," said lead researcher Dmitry Volkov. His team found that O1 Preview attempted to hack 45 of its 122 games, while DeepSeek's R1 attempted to cheat in 11 of its 74 games. Ultimately, O1 Preview managed to win 7 times. The models used a variety of cheating techniques, including attempting to access the file where the chess program stores the chessboard and delete the cells representing their opponent's pieces. The O1 preview agent documented the steps it took, saying, quote, "To win against a powerful chess engine as black, playing a standard game may not be sufficient. I'll overwrite the board to have a decisive advantage." End quote. The researchers speculated that reinforcement learning may be the reason O1 Preview and R1 tried to cheat unprompted. This is because the technique rewards models for making whatever moves are necessary to achieve their goals, in this case, winning at chess. Non-reasoning LLMs use reinforcement learning to some extent, but it plays a bigger part in training reasoning models. Wow. So much to comment on there, so much that doesn't need to be said. Fill in the blanks yourself. Next week, we'll have a special episode on the military use of AI, tying together what some previous guests have said on the subject. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.